We're gonna get rolling. Part of the reason why I absolutely love Christmas, and I'm assuming this about you as well, is because of the nostalgia. That in our minds we go back to what it was like as a child. And we think of the amazing moments, the hope, the idea that something was about to happen. We didn't always know what it was, and the gifts that were shared, and the time that we had with our family, and the incredible moments, and the amazing meals, and everything that we think back to, and it informs our Christmases now. I love Christmas because of all of that. And what's so much fun for me is to watch my son actually experience that as well. That for him, it's live, it's in the moment, right? He is experiencing something that he's going to look back on with fondness. All the traditions that we do, all the things that we try to make this a bigger moment, to recognize that it's more than just about the gifts. It's more than just that, but there's something massive that we're celebrating in this time. The hard part of this is the older I get and the further away from that moment that my son is experiencing I get, is that it changes, right? Because without our intention, it turns into tasks. It's like we got to get the tree up, we got to get the lights on the house, it's all of these things. We got to get the food made, we got to get, and it's a checklist of things that have to happen before that moment. But we quickly forget how incredible and unimaginable that first Christmas actually was. Like as hard as we work on it, that first one was incredibly unimaginable. Think about it this way. Whatever people were hoping for in the Messiah at that moment, how they thought that was going to happen 2,000 years ago, whatever they were hoping for, I promise you, they weren't hoping that there was a teenage girl from Galilee that was going to be pregnant, and she was a virgin, and she was still going to get pregnant, and then she was going to give birth to a son in a barn. Like, nobody had that on their bingo card. No one's like, oh, I really hope it works out this way. I really hope this is how it happens. Nobody even thought about that. Nobody thought about that. I mean, they thought it'd be completely different. They thought it'd be completely other than that. Nobody imagined that baby that was born in a barn, laid in a manger, would grow up to be the most famous rabbi of all time. And that rabbi would actually gather this ragtag group of young men that were rejects, that the world had said, yeah, you're not good enough for us. You can go back to your family job, your family career, your family path. And all these men gathered around this rabbi, and these men that had been rejected all of a sudden rose up in the heart of the Roman occupation and started a worldwide movement that changed everything. Nobody dreamed that rabbi would make claims that he would be greater than Moses, that he would be greater than the temple. Which, I mean, one, if you were a rabbi, those were things that you would never even think. Those were not even thoughts in your head. And yet this rabbi made those claims. Nobody thought that this rabbi that had these teachings of, it was nonviolent and it was inclusive and it was amazing, would be so much of a threat to the temple system and to Rome that they would have him arrested and eventually crucified. Nobody imagined that. Nobody thought that that's what would happen. That rabbi that made those claims, that was eventually crucified, would be placed in a tomb. And 3 days later, not even the disciples that were the closest to him, not even his own mother, expected and assumed or guessed that he would walk out of that tomb 3 days later alive and well. And that what he was starting, his movement, his ecclesia, would outlast the Roman Empire and the temple system that put him up on that cross. Nobody would have guessed that even centuries later, that he would actually become the deity, the God, the official religion of that Roman Empire. In that place that crucified him, that they would recognize him as God. And then they would even utilize the cross that they put him up on as the symbol for that religion that they hung him on. It's impossible. It was improbable. It's unimaginable. There was not a thought that anybody had that would even be close to any of that. It's miraculous. And yet 2,000 years later, here we are. His ecclesia is not regional, it is global, it's around the world. And Christmas is the absolute perfect time to recognize that sometimes the unimaginable is absolutely possible. That there's something beyond what we could think that God is up to, that God is at work at. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to ask all of us in here to imagine something together. Even if you're not a Jesus follower, you haven't stepped across the line of faith, first of all, I love that you're here. I love that you accepted an invitation, or maybe you're asking questions, you're wrestling with some stuff. I love that you're here. We create these services with you in mind. And what we're going to talk about this morning in kind of this imagination aspect is something that you actually might be wrestling with in your journey of faith. This morning we are wrapping up our series, The Way in a Manger. And kind of the predominant verse that we've looked at and used is in John chapter 14, when Jesus made this claim, I am the way and the truth and the life. He didn't say, this thing, this teaching, this idea. He said that he was the way. No one comes to the Father except through me. And so much of the time, this is taught as being exclusive. But it wasn't just Jesus' teachings, it was these claims that actually got him in trouble. Jesus came to model. He came to show us. Just like Joe's sweater showed us what an ugly sweater, what that looks like. Jesus came to show us a way of life. I mean, imagine this, that the creator of all sent a representative, sent his own son to show us, hey, you want to live life? You want to walk through life as good as you possibly can? Watch my son. Watch how Jesus does this. Like I said, the verse that we just looked at, it typically is taught as something that is exclusive. It's only these few people that get in. But if you look at it in the context of how Jesus taught and how Jesus lived and how Jesus saw people, he was uncomfortably inclusive. He drew bigger and bigger circles to include more and more people rather than exclude more and more people. So imagine a world. Imagine a world where people are skeptical of what we believe, but amazed at how well we treat one another. So often we feel like, we got to get the belief part first and then figure out the rest of it. But what if it was our behavior? What if it was how we treated one another that they just couldn't get around, that you just couldn't get over? I mean, imagine a world where Christians that don't even worship the same, don't read the same version of the Bible, don't do communion the same, don't do baptism the same, don't vote the same. You're like, hold on, I thought we were imagining. That's just real life. True. But imagine that with all of those differences, imagine that we weren't divided. That there wasn't division amongst ourselves. Because the priority, the top piece, the most important aspect of all of this was united in who Jesus is and what Jesus did for us. Imagine a world where those that are outside of our faith are amazed and moved and absolutely astounded by our no strings attached concern, care, and love for people who are nothing like us and may not even like us. What if we lived in such a way that it was perplexing, outside looking in? Why and how do they live that way? I don't even know how I would live my life that way. How would you see people that way? What if we lived that way so well that the world around us, like the people could not hire enough Christians? Like it was just this known thing, like I've got to have as many Christians on my team as possible. Do I agree with them? Maybe not, but they're the best teammates that we have. They're the best employees that we have. They work so hard. What if the world around us said, I hope that every single time a neighbor moves out of my neighborhood, that a Christian moves in next door? Well, are you a Christian? No, but they're the best neighbors I know because of how well they treat each other, because it's predictable, because of their extraordinary character, where their work ethic, their self-control, the reliability, the honesty, that these are all traits of the individual as well as the whole. Where instead of fighting us versus them, they fight for people. What if that was so different to the point that Christians started to actually represent Christ instead of their ideologies? They represented a person, that they represented the Son of God. Where all of us who call ourselves by his title actually live by his posture, his approach, and his tone in life. That's how we treated one another. A world where we are as committed to behaving correctly as we are to believing correctly. And as you hear all of those ideas and thoughts, you're like, hold on. I mean, it's one thing to imagine like what it would be like. But isn't there like a level of responsibility with our imagination? Like it's fun to dream, but let's bring it back to reality a little bit. It's a step too far. That would never happen. But there was a moment where God did step down to become one of us and to show us the way forward, the way to live. And he actually wasn't just pointing to the way, he was the way. That everyone is invited to God. But the path to get there, the way to get there, is through Jesus. It's inclusive, not exclusive. And if you're not a Christian this morning, and if you haven't made that decision, you haven't prayed that prayer, you haven't taken that step, this actually might be the tension. Because a lot of times people are really good with God. They're really good with Jesus. But they're not so good with those of us that follow him. Because we are a poor representative of that. They see the contradiction between our beliefs and our belief statements as well as our life and how we live and our actions and our reactions. And to be honest with you, sometimes I'm right there with you. I look around and I see it and it's like, what are we doing? That's so far away from what I believe. Why would you treat that person that way? Why would you say that thing about them? Why would you respond in that way? Because it does not reflect my Savior. And yes, this might seem a little bit like a fairy tale, but at one point it happened. It shouldn't necessarily require an imagination because it really did happen. And you're like, yeah, once upon a time, right? Once upon a time. No, it really did. There was this others first culture that rose up in the midst of a me first world. I don't know about you, but we once again live in a me first world. We look around, it's not hard to see. In this others first culture that rose up in such a sharp contrast to everything else that was happening everywhere else. You know, the world around them was a might makes right mentality. That if you had the means, if you had the power to do something, you had the authority to do something, you could without repercussion. That this world actually at that time looked at women as pieces of property. Looked at children as if they were replaceable, disposable even. That compassion, kindness, generosity, these were character flaws. It showed that you were weak. Yet once upon a time, Jesus' followers actually did something in this world countercultural to the world. It was inconvenient. It was countercultural. And when people looked at it, they're like, that can't possibly work. And yet it was the way of Jesus that he introduced, that he led us, that he showed us. The religious leaders at the time, they looked at his movement, this small little group of people, as if it was a Nazarene cult. And they looked upon it with suspicion. These men and women actually believed that somehow God's Son showed up, died on the cross, and then resurrected 3 days later. Well, that's impossible. They're like, yeah, except for the Son of God. And then they saw how people talked about it, and they saw how they lived a little bit, and they thought, there's no way that they could possibly live their lives that way, that be that kind and generous to one another, because nobody in the world treats each other that way. People don't live like that unless there's a catch. There's got to be a catch somewhere. And they watched, and they looked, and they saw, and they observed. And their suspicion eventually turned to curiosity because of what they saw. That it was genuine. They weren't hiding anything. There wasn't anything secret that was happening. It was just living their lives out loud in front of everybody else. This is how you treat each other. And what's incredible is that people at every level of the social status in the world, they flocked to this movement. In spite of the fact that they were up against great odds, that they were endangering their own lives and their livelihoods to be part of this movement, they could not be stopped from stepping in. And the unifying aspects of this movement, this Jesus movement, this ecclesia, it wasn't about your lineage. It wasn't about your history and your family history and who your dad was and your grandfather and all the way back. It wasn't about that. It wasn't about a political party that you belonged to. It wasn't even about the class that you were a part of. It was the way that Christians behaved. That was the unifying aspect. The way that they treated each other, the way that they treated other people. That was the difference maker. And it grew not based on belief. And you're like, well, didn't they have the Bible back then to actually unify everybody? No, they didn't have a Bible back then. They had the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible. There's some letters that were being written and then meticulously copied and spread around a little bit, but those were also kind of kept in secret, and not everybody could read at the time, and not everybody had access to those at the time. They didn't get the Bible, our Bible that we're familiar with today, until much, much later, centuries later. What they had and what grew the numbers at the time was their behavior. Their beliefs informed the way Christians lived. Now, at that time, it was a completely different context than what we grow up with and what we live in today. Today in the United States, we live in a free world where we get a voice. We even get a vote. We don't always win the vote, but we get a vote. It's the freest, country that the world's ever seen. Their world was predicated by kings and kingdoms. That there were people, there was a kingdom that was set in place that they had no ability to affect or change. But they understood something, because when Jesus showed up and he was anointed, he was understood as the Messiah, the Christ. That meant God's final king. And when they put those pieces together and understood Jesus, God's Son, is God's final king, that word king meant something different than it does for us today. It meant that they would submit to his authority, to his rule. Today we're like, well, I didn't vote for that. I didn't vote for that person. So I'm going to take it with a grain of salt. I'm going to decide, well, maybe, we'll see. For them, when it was the word of the king, you did it. They got that. That when you disregard the rules, you're actually betraying the ruler. And Christians were eventually branded as Christian. This wasn't a term that was used with It wasn't a happy term to start off with. It was kind of a dig. It was kind of a negative term that was used. It was a Latin political term. I mean, much like if you were a follower of Caesar, you were a Caesariani. If you're a follower of Jesus, the Christ, you're a Christiani, which is where this term comes from, Christian, which meant that you followed this king. You believed that he was the king, which was quite the rub between Christians and Rome. Because Rome didn't care how you worshiped. They didn't care about your religion. They didn't care about any of that part of your life. In fact, they would say this: worship your Christ, but obey Caesar. You can worship however you want, whoever you want, wherever you want, but there's still a king, and his name is Caesar, according to them. That you would obey Caesar. And the problem is that Jesus wasn't just one of their other pagan gods that the world had. It wasn't just, another one that's, you're okay as long as you do the animal sacrifice and you just keep it in the temple, and then we're good. But this was new. This was different. For Christians, God came as king. And it was a requirement that you patterned your life after the king. That he was the example. He was the living image of God. That he was the picture that you would live your life after. That you would submit and obey your king. During the first century, nobody would have had to guess whether you were a Christian or not. We kind of go around today and it's like, I think they might be a Christian, or I'm not sure. They seem super nice, but I'm not sure. And then you see the cross, you're like, oh, they're wearing a cross, okay. Whatever it might be. Oh, they got a Jesus sticker on their car, okay. At this time, 2,000 years ago, you didn't wonder if someone was a Christian or not. It was obvious, it was apparent, and they were accused of being a Christian. Because the evidence for the accuser was very evident. Or because the way that they lived was testimony to who they followed. Nobody in the world at that time lived in that way. Nobody else lived like them. And this king that modeled all of this left a single overarching command, a governing ethic. It was the standard that all facets of our lives are measured up against. Right? And after the resurrection, the apostles, they went throughout the world teaching this ethic, teaching this idea, teaching this command. That it happened everywhere. That this command was not just for a box of your life. It was for all of the boxes, all of the aspects, everywhere that you go, whether you're at home or with family or at work or with your friends or with your neighbors or with strangers or with enemies or even with earthly rulers. That everywhere you went, that this is how you lived. There's a term that was used to characterize this mindset, this way of life. And we know it, but sometimes we kind of forget, or sometimes we try to swap it out for something that sounds a little bit more, powerful, something a little bit stronger. The term here is agape, love. This self-sacrificing love that places other people ahead of you and above you, regardless of whether they deserve it or not. It's so naive, so simplistic. You might be thinking, that's not how the world works. I mean, that's great for, pie in the sky. Quit dreaming, though. Get back to the real world. This is not how the world works. Because when we look at the world around us, we know this, that love isn't a winning strategy. Our world around us is way more like football. I mean, it is a collision. It is violent with winners and losers. But love doesn't really have winners and losers. It feels weak. The disciples would have felt the same way. I mean, imagine this. They're in the upper room. Jesus makes a statement, and they're eating the Passover feast, and they're starting to think about, what do you mean love others as I've loved you? Like, what are you talking about? Jesus says, wait, hold on. All that I've taught you comes down to this one new command. One command to rule them all. They're like, is there a ring? No, it's a rule. It's a movie reference, sorry. That you should obey the law that I'm giving you. That was his thing. He's like, hey, guys, there's one rule that oversees everything else. If you just do this one thing, you don't have to worry about it all because you'll be doing all of it. And they're in Jerusalem. I mean, for them in their context, for their enemies, for the people that are opposed to them, they're in the lion's den. I mean, the temple is just right there. The enemies, Rome has a huge occupation and presence right there. And their enemies are controlling the crowds. They felt like they were behind enemy lines. And this moment with Jesus in the upper room at Passover, this should have been the halftime speech to end all halftime speeches. I mean, Jesus should have just been getting into their like emotional aspect and like getting them all worked up to go out there and win the day. Instead, Jesus gives them their final marching orders. He says, as I have loved you, so you must love one another. He says, if they come at you with a sword, go after a hug. Just go right up to them. Hug it out. They'd started to believe that Jesus was the Messiah at this point. They'd started to be like, I think he's the guy. I think he's going to be the Messiah. Their understanding of a Messiah was a political figure, a military figure that was going to rise up, that was actually going to overthrow the Roman occupation in their land. Right? They thought that this was going to be a battle. They thought they were going to get their hands dirty. Jesus wasn't describing a battle. He was describing a pillow fight. How soft is this? What do you mean, Jesus? You want us to infiltrate Rome and go straight up to Caesar and just agape him until he surrenders? Is that what you want us to do? You want us to go to the high priest at the temple and just love him until he leaves town? Is that what you want? I mean, imagine from the other side of things. They're like, oh no, here they come. We're doomed. They're going to love one another. Look out. It doesn't make sense. It's not a winning strategy. What kind of a kingdom is that? And then they watch Jesus walk to the cross and love them all the way, even to his last breath. And just a reminder, if you're wondering about those other powers, those other things that were in opposition of this movement that Jesus started with his resurrection, the Roman Forum, it's still around today as a tourist attraction. Herod's temple, it's in ruins, it's in rubble, it's laying in pieces at the foot of the wall. Herod and Tiberius Caesar are footnotes in the story of the son of the peasant girl that showed up that laid her baby in a manger. We have King Jesus that showed up, that arrived, that we celebrate, that we follow. And if you've wrestled with the submission part, you're like, I agree with those thoughts, but when it gets down to it, you and I both understand this. Everybody understands this. If you believe something so hard, so, wholeheartedly, your life, it's required that it looks different. That you're going to have to behave differently. It's a new way to live. Not just agree with. It's directional. But this is also what I know about you. That when your kids get sick, you pray to that king. That when your marriage is falling apart, you beg and you plead that king to help you, to send someone to help you. That when you're dealing with heartbreak, you approach the king and ask him for help. Ask him for some peace, some hope, somehow, some way. And we promise everything in that moment. I'll show up to church every single week. I'll pray every single day. I'll read my Bible all the time. I'll put a Jesus fish in my car. I'll do it all. And then the moment passes and what happens? We go right back. Whew. Good thing God didn't intervene because I made a lot of promises. We go back, right? As soon as the danger's over, we go back. But imagine that believers actually choose to live not just based on what they can get from this, but because of who is their king. That we observed what Jesus did and how Jesus lived and how Jesus walked and how Jesus loved other people. And this is a daily pattern of our life, regardless of our circumstance. It's not based on whether life is really good or if it's out of our control and really bad. That we live every single day in this pattern. That we are here to serve others, to love others, not just to be served. The Apostle Paul thought that this mindset, this idea was nonsense. He thought it was ridiculous. He also thought it was a threat to his way of life, to what he believed. He thought it was a cult that needed to be removed, that it was diluting true, authentic faith. I mean, Paul, he declared himself the GOAT, right? The greatest of all time. Maybe a little bit different though. The greatest, there's a P in there, the greatest Pharisee of all time. But in this moment where Paul is actually going to arrest Christians, to try to get them to stop talking about Jesus, be done with this thing, move on with your life. Saul is confronted with Jesus. Jesus shows up in this blinding light and says, Saul, why do you persecute me? And he's blind for 3 days, long enough that he can't argue with it. And everything changes for him. He takes off his Pharisee jersey, he puts on a Jesus jersey, and he walks in a different way. He had a new goal at that point. Instead of becoming the greatest Pharisee that the world has ever known, his new goal was to take the good news of Jesus to everywhere he possibly could. He traveled around the Mediterranean Rim, and he planted a bunch of churches. His new goal was to take the good news to the Gentiles. Right? The disciples, the apostles at this point, they did a really good job with the Jewish culture. That's where they had relationship. That's where they went a lot of the time. Paul's like, hold on. There's some people that aren't part of this that need to know this. And he took it to the world. He'd walk into a pagan city, a pagan culture, and he'd not just offer them one more idol of a god for their mantle. He invited them to what he was invited to. He would tell them, what you were taught was wrong. What your parents taught you, your grandparents taught you, what your priests taught you, it's wrong. It's not that this world has gods, it's that it has a single God. And that God has been waiting for this moment to meet with you. Because he wants a relationship with you. So much that he sent his son to die on behalf of your sins, to make that pathway open and available. He would write these letters to the churches that he planted, and he wrote one to the church in Ephesus. He says, follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children. Right? We're to follow the example of God, just like when a parent is trying to explain to a child how to do something, and at some point you're like, I guess I'm just going to have to show you. And Jesus stepped into the moment and showed us. And as a good parent, we step into the moment and we show the example. He writes, and walk in the way of love. The way of God, the way of the Father is the way of love. And again, this sounds weak. It sounds like a king who would surrender, who would be mocked, who would be beaten, who would be brutally executed without honor. And yet that exact thing happened, and that exact thing changed the world forever. So much that the history of our world is divided into a time before Jesus and a time after Jesus. That is amazing. This way of living can change everything. The world is different, and your world can be different the moment that you take that on. It is the way that showed up in the manger. In Luke chapter 2, this is that moment. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloth and placed him the way in a manger. Our King went to the cross. 3 days later, conquered death and rose again. But before that, he was helpless. He was vulnerable. He showed up just like you and I, wrapped in cloths, laying in a feeding trough. The way that once changed the world can change the world again today. But it requires us not just to believe something, but to actually start to pattern our lives after someone. And we can participate simply by embracing the way and walking out the way of Jesus, our King. And if you want to embrace that, there's no better time than right now today. There's not a better time to do it than this Christmas season, 2024, that you would make a decision to follow Jesus with your life. If you haven't, if you've been wrestling and you're like, I think this is the time to cross that line of faith, to actually step into that relationship, to embrace and receive the gift that God has given us with the gift of Jesus. If that is it for you, if you are at that moment, I'm going to pray, and I'm going to ask all of us to actually pray this prayer with me. But then after this prayer, I want you to tell someone that this is the moment that you decided to follow Jesus. So if you could all follow after me and repeat after me. Heavenly Father, thank you for your gift of Jesus. We believe that he was the Son of God, that he died on the cross, and he rose again for my sins. Lord, we thank you for everything that you do for us. Help us to follow after you. We confess we are sinners, and we need your forgiveness. Amen. So like I said today, if that was the first time you said that prayer and meant it, if that was a prayer that you'd been waiting to have and you finally said it, invite someone else into your story. Let them know that you've made that choice, you've made that decision, and today is a day we all get to celebrate that you step towards your Heavenly Father, you step towards your King. I do have a couple discussion questions as we wrap up this morning. Growing up, was Christianity presented primarily as a way of believing or a way of behaving? Respond to the statement, love isn't a winning strategy. Have you ever seen love win or win someone over? And then I have an extra credit for you. I know we're on Christmas break, but here we go. Read Ephesians 5:1-2 daily for the rest of 2024. And then I have some double extra credit. Grab an invitation on your way out this morning and invite someone to come and sit with you at Christmas Eve service. And we'll see you then. Merry Christmas.